The anomaly in the scramble for Africa. Abyssinian warlords enabled shareholders. The anomaly of the Berlin Conferences of 1884 scramble for African rich resources designed Abyssinian village brigands as partitioners, not as victims a shareholder in their absence. They were planned to serve as the mirror images of the General Act of Berlin on African soil, common turf of meeting to all signatories to solve their clashing disputes, and to avoid bloodbath on African soil between colonial rivalries. The paradoxical Act of Scramble for Africa, 1884-1885, by European colonial powers and genocidaries that balkanized, carved up the continent to their wishes regardless of existing political boundaries or the will of its people. While the continent largely succumbed to European domination, they granting Abyssinian chieftains to take a lion's share of the scramble in absentia. No Africa representatives had attended in the conference, as 𝗏𝗏 Hertzlet and others documented in the Map of Africa, by treaty complied in 3 volumes published in 1909. Of all the continents in the world, Europe is the most resourceless. There was some coal, yes, but not much else. Therefore, almost everything that Europe needed, and still needs to develop and survive, had to, or must, come from abroad. It explains, in somewhat macabre manner, the brutality of, and genocides committed by, the Europeans who went out into the world to acquire land resource which were in turn shipped back to develop Europe, and by extension, the United States of America, as Boateng documented in the year 2005. By cynically formalizing the scramble for Africa and its resources by European and North America powers, the Berlin Conference consolidated the balkanization of Africa for imperialist exploitation and cemented the base for Africa being the most atomized exploited economically, and development continued on the planet as documented by Sankor in 2005. Without Africa and its Caribbean extensions, plantations, the modern world, as we know it, does not exist. The wealth of the West was built on Africa's exploitation. Profits from slave trading and from sugar, coffee, and tobacco are only a small part of the story. What mattered was the push and pull from this industry transformed the Western Europe's economies. English banking, insurance, shipbuilding, wool and cotton manufacturing, copper and iron smelting in the cities of Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow multiplied in response to direct-indirect stimulus of the slave plantation, as documented by Drayton in 2005. Colonization of Africa was not an isolated event. The colonization of Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries was not a sudden, isolated event, but rather the culmination of a long history of exploitation that had its roots in the transatlantic slave trade. For 4 centuries, European powers engaged in the systematic capture, transportation, and enslavement of millions of Africans, a practice that fundamentally shaped their economic and political relationship. The UNESCO reported that Africa's losses during the 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade must be put at some 210 million human beings. We witnessed a transformation where Europeans, once themselves victims of slavery under the Roman Empire, evolved into the perpetrators of a brutal system of enslavement against African peoples. A slave of Rome turned to a brutal slaveholder and entrepreneur. The infrastructure of dehumanization, the economic structures built on forced labor, and the political justifications for domination that characterized the slave trade provided a foundation upon which the later colonial project would be built. In essence, the scramble for Africa represented a continuation of these exploitative policies, seeking to extract resources and control populations through direct political and economic control, rather than solely through the trade in human beings. Although the colonization of Africa stretched back to the Greco-Roman period of the 4th century BC, the late 19th century marks a distinct and significant period in the history of European colonialism, and Africa had a profound and lasting impact, reshaping African societies, economies, and political landscapes in ways that continue to resonate today. European settler colonies before Berlin Conference. Even before the official scramble for Africa codified by the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, European powers had already established a significant colonial presence on the continent. Portugal was credited for to be the mothers of slaves blessed by their pop, had a long-standing presence in Angola and Mozambique dating back to the 15th century, and eye-opener of the reset of geographical Europe, henceforth flowed her footsteps. The Dutch Boers of Cape Colony in southern Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries that Britain consolidated its hold. France's settler colonies expanding its influence along the North African coast, particularly in Algeria, had begun to carve out territories and exert influence in various regions. These early colonial ventures were often characterized by resource extraction, trade, and attempts to impose European political and social structures, setting the stage for the more formalized and aggressive period of colonization that would follow the Berlin Conference. The major factors that lead European colonizers to assemble in Berlin was to solve the pre-programmed overlapping conflicts of interest claimed TERFs by legitimizing that each of claiming. They had secured territories by signing treaties with local chiefs, sultans, etc., nomming villages. Thus, it was only a matter of time before the greedy European monarchs and the greedy European settlers began to warn each other about the ownership of the continent's resource-rich of precise minerals such diamonds, gold, platinum, copper, cobalt, Elron uranium, etc., and others raw materials like rubber, ivory, etc., which were essential for European industries to survive and function, as was the cases with the European colonialists in America. A German autocrat who built a new empire in the heartland of Europe, as never before in European history, exploiting the tensions of Europe on the African continent and the interests of all Europeans, including the Ottoman Empire and the United States, catalyzed the Berlin Conference in the Scramble for Africa in 1884. Treaties of friendships, a pathological lie. The names, documents, and very existence of these alleged chiefs or sultans were often shrouded in mystery, and the treaties themselves were often dubious agreements forged through coercion, deception, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what a treaty even meant in the eyes of the local populations. As 𝗏 and others documented in 1909, the fine print of these agreements and the African perspective were conveniently omitted, revealing a deeply flawed and self-serving narrative designed to legitimize the European colonization of Africa. The so-called Treaty of Friendship often served as a cunning disguise, a pathological lie meticulously crafted to mask ulterior motives. It was, in essence, a deliberate facade designed to legitimize a predatory agenda. The invasion, genocide, colonization, and ruthless exploitation of Africa's abundant resources. Beneath the veneer of amicable relations lay a calculated strategy to extract wealth from the continent, both above and below its soil, to enslave its people for cheap labor, and to ship these stolen assets back to enrich and develop the colonizers' homeland. This deceitful friendship was nothing more than a prelude to plunder, a cynical tool used to pave the way for unimaginable suffering and lasting devastation across the African continent. The 1884 Scramble was for African resources and labors. The late 19th century marked the first major climacteric period for the African continent, a profound and disruptive period for the African continent that has been suffering from it to the very date united European colonists, driven by greed for resources and avarice, shifted their colonial focus from the Americas towards Africa. The period of intense competition among European powers, each vying for control of vast territories and resources. As European colonizers cast their covetous eyes on the African continent, they sought to legitimize their land grabs through a veneer of legal justification. The unification of all Europeans under a single, cohesive identity and purpose in specific colonial contexts was vital among competition European colonial powers to avoid bloodbath on African soil, as it was the cases in Americas. That was the main goal of the initiation taken by the autocrat Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of the German Empire. He hosted the conference 13 resourceless, greedy and avarice European autocrats and monarchical representatives of Britain, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Sweden and Norway, Turkey, and the USA to Berlin. The first sitting of the Berlin Conference of the Scramble for Africa, initiated by Otto Bismarck, was held on the 15th November 1884, terminated at labors on the 26th of February 1885, a day a General Act signed, and ratified by all except the USA. They carved up the continent, and to regulate European colonization's schizophrenia in grabbing Africa, and was to prevent the pre-programmed overlapping planned claims between rivals of European powers in colonization and exploitation of rich African resources before it led to bloodbath on Africa soil, and who have already secured a foothold in Africa. What did Abyssinia and European colonists have in common? The binary traits and narratives of all Abyssinian warlords in power to the present depart from the tyrant of Axum, Ezana. He was converted to the Byzantine version, also known as Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the 4th AD in Aksum, a collection of folklore, myth, legends, ballads, wishes, and whims, etc. of old Northwest Asian people compiled by a number of unknown authors from generation to generation in Hebrew writing called Torah, and Bible by Christians most profoundly by Europeans converted to Christianity by sword by Roman Empire. Independent of the discrepancy of many versions of the alleged, so-called the nominal, Holy Bible, a misnomer, interpreted to their wishes. Henceforth, Abyssinia village chieftains in the Horn of Africa were treated by Europeans, etc. as exceptional out of Africa, as another black bother within Africa, a fake kingdom of Prester John. The invention of Portuguese, Prester John Christian Kingdom. The legend of Prester John Christian Kingdom that was known since the 12th century in Europe, and the whereabouts were not known for 4 centuries, that the Portuguese kings who unraveled as the actual Abyssinian in 16th century turned the departing point for the European colonizers to treat as another brother out of Africa. The 1540s saw a peculiar alliance of Portugal, the commissioning of military commanders, musketeers, cannons, and mercenaries for a rescue mission at the request of Abyssinian warlords demonstrates a willingness to project power and exert influence in the region. Driven by a complex mix of religious zeal and strategic ambition, intervened in local conflicts, and finally to set up a settler colony. This intervention, framed as protecting another black brother from perceived threats, reveals a patronizing attitude towards indigenous populations, either Muslims or adherents of ancient African religions and traditions, as prime adversaries in their colonial project. Despite the fact that those traditions predated Christian beliefs diametrically opposite to the chauvinistic, patriarchal-ruled view of what was called Christian religion, the collection's folklore of old Northwest Asian people for centuries, drafts written in Hebrew, one piece of scrolling papyrus, found gradually created a snowball effect. It increased in size, scope compiled as Torah, and Bible by Christians. The Roman Emperor Constantine I, reigned from 306 to 337 BC, was converted to Christianity and institutionalized as official religion of the empire. The Roman Empire converted the rest of Europe to Christianity by using swords to cut off heads or convert and enslave the indigenous peoples. They were called barbarians, a term that Rome took from the Greek word barbaros, means aliens. It was the arrival of the 9 Roman saints, that is, the Byzantine monks who founded the monastery in northern Abyssinia, in Aksum in 500 AD, and translated the New Testament into local language called 𝗤𝗄. Soon the court became Christian, and the cathedrals of Aksum were built. From then on, the church was dependent on Egypt until the mid-1950s. Aksum under the tutelage of Greco-Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, which stretched across 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and was the most powerful empire in history, treated its new converts as a dog of the earth, with the same goals and the same mythical enemies, independent of insignificance wets or East mythical version of interpretations and claims. While the all translate the same strange book from Hebrew writing that the all have nothing in it, but interpreted to their language as it suits to rule, invade, expand, and build an empire. Aksum was extend arms of Greco-Roman Empire. The Greek language was spoken, and the religion was the vulgar version of Greek. Churches and monasteries and cathedrals were built by Greeks. Most of their names were, and yet are, Greek. The Greco-Roman Empire enabled the Abyssinian warlord of Aksum called 𝗔𝗂𝗍 to invade the people of the south to Aksum. That is the only reason of his conversion of the fact the ground to gain support, utter weapon as local people, mentorship and collaboration for the same objectives: acquisition of unknown land, conquest, invasion, plunder, slaves and cattle ridding, etc., from neighboring lands and people. European colonizers and Abyssian chieftains, tyrants throughout to Abbey, were all driven by ideologies shared common threads of paternalism, viewed themselves as superior and entitled to rule over others for their supposed benefit. A belief in hierarchical structures that placed them at the top, chauvinistic attitudes that promoted their own group's superiority, and often a degree of ignorance or willful blindness to the complexities and values of the societies they sought to dominate. Nepotism and favoritism created systems that consolidated power, and that is what gave them an advantage over the rest of independent people of the Horn of Africa, if not the entire Africa. What is Christianity about Abyssinia? In 1868, Blanc reported, "In Africa more than in any other part of the world, we general find natives in their greater purity, the Abyssinian, in contrary much analogy to the European nations, the offspring of divers invaders at the present day. The clergy 𝗔𝗳𝗏s of the Abyssinian Coptic Orthodox Church were ignorant, bigot, and ill-equipped, have no literature, and dependent on Alexandria, Egypt until the 19th century. Not 1 out of 10 knows what they preach, mumble just like caste reorder. It is analogous to a British or a French preaching in Latin. The downtrodden illiterate masses follow them like a sheepfolk follow their sheep herder." It is crucial to understand the personalization of religious myths from West Asian folklore as a means to hold power, justifying all the crimes they had committed. First, began from the translation of 2 volumes of books into local languages in 13th or 14th century from Alexandria. Egypt arrived to the local warlords. As a result, that gave the birth, backings from Europe and provision of all tools the Abyssinia chieftains and the myth of other black brothers desperately need to conquer, colonized, settled, and maintained the status quo of the empire to the very date. Titted, against all others, cling into power until the bullet got their head or last hour flight out the empire, and is the facts of Abyssinia warlords' history in most cases. It is Coptic Orthodox Church called religion that arrived the region independent of time in the 4th or 5th century to Aksum, and one must bear in mind the Abyssinian priest, 𝗔𝗳𝗏s, and warlords have been 2 sides of the same coin throughout her history, since 4th century to the very date, with insignificant time gap of 17 years of naked dictatorial rule of Stalinist military junta. Even worse, they have been considered as their intellect throughout, and the behave as such too without shame, and they have their fingers everywhere. They can pick a pen but write nothing but blasted lies, myth-tales, that have a physical and mental burden of the people, allergic to work but eat like ruminants. The European missionaries, such as the Jesuits who were deployed in Abyssinian, designated Abyssinia version of Coptic Orthodox Christianity as the vulgar version of claimed Christianity. Be that as it may, the major goal of the Portuguese was indeed in search and secure settler colonial turf to control the region, particularly the Red Sea and its surrounding coast, controlling African territories, secure territories along its coasts. While Abyssinian wandering warlords who has never built and lived in house with window, begged for bread, have been obligate dependent on foreign aids, most importantly, firearms, ammunition, finances, mentorship, political backing in local stage, thus the key got its lock. Settler colonial mentality. They both have settler colonial mentality, slaveholders and trades. They have been converted to Christianity of their own version. So far their major goal had been acquisitions of territories, The difference of the version does not play a significant role by all European invaders, that is why they all backed treated as lapdog, and provided all tools to the Abyssinian warlords. They enabled them to establish an empire by committing similar, if no identical, crime against humanity the Europeans committed via sea and oceans. They enabled to maintain the default 𝗤𝗏𝗆 system of the settler colonial empire. They enabled the series of naked personal dictators party such as 𝗦𝗰𝗿𝗆, his loyal servants and recruits 𝗦𝗰𝗿𝗆 and the contemporary naked delusional global pariah and war criminal to award Nobel Peace Prize Abiy Ahmed. To commit heinous war crimes and genocides, they have been a burden of the downtrodden masses of the populations incarcerated in one of the most backward empire on the planet. The masses of the population in ox-drawn arid plow as it has been for thousands of years, hindering progress, effectively holding back the potential of the people to improve in agricultural sector, to feed, sustain life and family, on which the power swindlers prey up on throughout her history. Abyssinian warlords took their lion's share, backed by Europeans in competing. A historical anomaly of European colonialist projects all over the world, where their ships were anchored and their legs were suspended at this time in history. European colonialists chose three most ruthless of all outlaw bloodthirsty village chieftains like 𝗏𝗏 II ruled from 1855 to 1868. He was 𝗦𝗏 rose to power in Gondar. The second one was 𝗤𝗍s IV reigned from 1877 to 1889, rose to power in Aksum, and finally Menelik II of Ankober ruled at 𝗏𝗏 from 1889 to 1913. They were known in folks' mouth as half a devil and half Habesha, Abyssinian in foreigners, as Henry Burritt documented in his book Published in 1868. They enabled them to cross the river near their birthplace, invade, commission genocide, and set up a corrupt, predatory colonial Euro-Abyssinia empire that now trades under the stolen fictional name of Ethiopia over 6-time lager and richer than virtual Abyssinia proper. 𝗏 renamed to fictitious name, Menelik II. Between 1868 and 1900, 𝗏 alone received from Britain, France, Italy, and Russia all in one 715,000 rifles and 50 million ammunition, as documented in 𝗤𝗏𝗿𝗆 in 1974. 𝗏 was chronic syphilis and a primary preferred patient of European physicians in Compton. Since his younger ages, he was diagnosed by number 8 European physicians and died sterile of neurosyphilis without biological offspring, who can neither read or write their alleged alphabet. It is important to bear in mind that Menelik was the underdog of 𝗏𝗏 for decades, until his death in April 1868, and then of 𝗤𝗍s until his death in March 1889. 𝗤𝗍s of Tigray was known to have the strongest and experienced army in the region. After his death, the disfranchised soldier, militias of both warlords of the north joined, with little resistance, agonist Menelik. He was advised by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗆𝗏, who escorted Menelik's arm the war expedition to Tigray not to take revenge, but to use them to invade the south in so-called in his 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏 project, that means invasion and a move with the premise of eliminations, and established the predatory settler colonial empire in northeast Africa. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗆𝗏 was the brain architect of the invention, establishment and maintains of the settler colonial empire. He served half of his life, about 30 years uninterrupted. He was the first European settler in Find, a minster of all arms smuggler and dealer, and smuggler of thousands of historical artifacts from the entire south, such as the crone of King of Kaffa to his homeland. He was award bitwedded, the men whom Menelik trust more than his wife. A fanatic Amarased phalange without Ulferd Ilgi, the settler colonial empire never existed at all. Among all animals, scorpions are the worst of all beasts, and among human mercenary academician, professionals like Richard Pankhurst and his offsprings, Edward Ullendorf, Alfred Ilg, just to list some among many, are the worst beasts of all. A disgrace to the moral and ethical codes of conduct of academic discipline, they took oath, and to serve with respect, and accountability to the credit of scholarship. But they turned into double burden to the downtrodden masses of population that survives under the gun pointed to their head in the open prison house from generation to generation. They have been at the back and the brain architects of every tyrannical rulers of the empire. They turned the bottleneck, hurdle to genuine scholars. Access to modern weaponry created and maintained Abyssinia Empire to the preset. The binary narratives, chameleon behavioral characters, and power greed of Abyssinian warlords enabled them acquire modern weaponry and strategic alliances at least since the arrival of Portugueses, the mothers of all triangularly slavery. Vividly. Henceforth, the European colonizer followed the footsteps of provided firearms and ammunitions, etc., to the outlaw wandering chieftains arose in the region in competing to enhance their level of influences accordingly. Throughout the history of the region, they enabled the outlaw and the cruelest bully village chieftains to cross the river next to their place of birth, to invade, commit genocides, occupy and settle in the south to Abyssinian proper. A historical analogy to the French settlers in Algeria backed by France, the Boers of South Africa, also known as Afrikaners and 𝗔𝗵𝗍s in Oromia, and the entire South backed by Europeans and the USA. The moral apostles. It has been European firearms, ammunition, mentorship, finance, political shield, etc., that created, maintained the predatory settler Colonial Habesha, real name, Abyssinia Empire. History teaches most importantly series of Abyssinia tyrannical rules built solely on the gun is inherently leave a life of pariah waiting in countdown of the same gun to get his head or internal collapse. Remember the fictitious name, Ethiopia, that appeared during the Greek translation of Septuagint from Hebrew Torah of the word Cush to Greek language. The version that was translated to the local Abyssinia language, called 𝗔𝗳𝗍, spoken around Aksum at that junction of history, that evolved to the modern Tigray or Tigrayan language. The Aksum warlord destroyed and enslaved Cush did not know the term Ethiopia, to whom series of warlords who climbed up to the political power of the new Abyssinia Empire builders. Thanks to European firearm and ammunition preaches to a fictitious version of Ethiopia as their history. Without slightest shame, the stole and replaced Abyssinian with Ethiopia in 1955, once they conquered the South in order to maintain in political power and oppress others, and to justify violence or discrimination. In conclusion, Habesha tyrants only understand the language of force that reflected their historical power dynamics. The term Ethiopia, as found in historical Greek and Roman archives, is an imaginary. It was used merely to differentiate themselves from the populations they encountered, invaded, and ultimately colonized, like Northern Africa, the renaming of KMT to Egypt and Northwest Asia. Thus it is not by chance that we can find a cartography that states the land mass south to Memphis, KMT, the capital city of Greco-Roman colony, as Ethiopia, and the juxtaposing water mass known as Ethiopian Ocean or Ethiopian Sea, used as late as mid-19th century, replaced with Atlantic Ocean. There is no historical name of state with this name to claim either archaeological or written evidence. The name is found in novel scribes of theological writings, wishes and whims, but not history. Thus biting an empty drum hard and louder might make harder and louder noise that 130 decibel will damage hearing, but do not make history, and that is what the Abyssinian and mercenary scholars and warlords have been engaged with. Abiy Ahmed preaches to his prophet, 𝗦𝗰𝗿𝗺𝗺, the contemporary delusional one man called Prosperity Party, who dreams of to establishing a 𝗩𝗿𝗆 system of Izana, built status and preached to prophet 𝗦𝗰𝗿𝗺𝗺, APOWs, a mental slave like Abiy his cohesive circles like his mentor 𝗏𝗏 Nega, 𝗦𝗰𝗿𝗆 Abdisa, just to list 3 out of many of his cohesive sickles. Once he consolidated the power at his hand, the personal dictator began to show his true face. A cold-blooded, ruthless killer assassinated the Abagadas of Karius, Dabsaguyu, people who even did not know who he is, just to name 2 out of thousands Oromo people from all spheres of life. Extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, mass detentions, torture, and suppression of political dissent, assassinations and pathological lie, etc., is his major accomplishment seen for the last 6 years. And it is as it has always been, it is only modern-day automated war machines like drones, fighter jets, automated firearms provided by the tyrants from Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, Russia, etc., maintained him in infamy at the contemporary dying settler colonial empire. These actions are reminiscent of the tyrannical leaders that Plato warned against in his book, The Republic. He was already seen as a global pariah due to his human rights record. The international community, including the European Union and the United States, has expressed concern over the situation in Ethiopia and called for an end to the violence and human rights abuses. But those are only words, and they have ever saved life. Action must follow. Abiy and his cohesive circles did never regard the social contract, what was called established laws written on pieces of paper by scribes. Once they hold the power, they began to suppress and operate without accountability. Rule of necropolitics coined by polymath 𝗂𝗍𝗆, who defines it as the power to decide who lives and who die and how they live and die. The actions and policies of killing against any demands for changes as the only means of the solution to cling into unchecked power to their last breath. In such regimes, where necropolitics reigns, the state wields its power to decide who lives and who dies, leaving no room for dialogue or peaceful dissent. The language of negotiation and compromise is lost. The absence of legal frameworks, fair regulations, and meaningful consequences for abuses of power creates a breeding ground for desperation and potential violence. Empire lives with his consciousnesses of the consciousness of death, and the settler colonial Abyssinia Empire shall not be otherwise.